welcome. I'm Woodrow Hartzog. If you haven't met me yet, I'm a professor of law and computer science at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a lawyer by training, though I do work with computer scientists and technologists. Oh, do I need to talk a little closer? Is this better? Oh, excellent. Okay. I'm a lawyer by trade, but I do work with technologists, and I have a background in information science as well. My main research area is privacy law, which I'll be talking about on tomorrow, but I also do a lot of research in artificial intelligence, law, and policy. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today for the next I guess we have about an hour and a half together, is AI governance. And by governance, Kilnam did a really good job of talking about the whole world of artificial intelligence governance, but I am specifically going to talk about law and policy. In other words, how do we create rules around artificial intelligence? What should those rules look like? And what should lawmakers and industry and those in civil society look for and care about when creating rules around artificial intelligence? And so the good news is that we're still in early days because we still actually haven't fully even defined what artificial intelligence is. I think Kilnam did a really good job of articulating the history of how we got here and where to go from here. And what I'm going to talk about today is not something that is really set in stone. As a matter of fact, I don't think there is any one approach to artificial intelligence law and policy that has been adopted by anyone yet. And so that's an exciting area to be in, and it's something that I'm thrilled to be a part of. Instead, what I want to talk about are ways in which we might, as lawmakers or people that work in industry or civil society, might go about identifying problems and harms that should be targeted by rules, by some sort of governance, identifying the values that we want to see reflected in those rules, and finding the right words and the right concepts for ways to think about artificial intelligence. And so I work with a lot of lawmakers on AI law and policy. And one of the really interesting things that I see a lot is that they tend to think of artificial intelligence as some kind of magic, right? That it's this sort of mystical force that's going to change the way that we work and live, and that it's sort of like the internet, but whereas the internet was a little explainable, artificial intelligence is a little more mysterious. And I think that is dangerous and can lead to some unintended regulatory consequences when lawmakers not only don't understand the technology that they're dealing with, which is actually common for all kinds of lawmakers, but more importantly, mythicize and romanticize the technology that they're dealing with. Because what that leads to is a general refrain to think about governing structures and more of a hands-off approach, which might be good, but it might not be. And so one of the things that I spend time trying to work with lawmakers about is simply understanding what we mean when we use the term AI or machine learning, and I try to impress upon them that if you look at it, it's really just all about algorithms and data and sensors, right? Sensors that collect data and then follow instructions, right? So I've got here, it looks like a scary, ghost, and then you pull the hat off, and it's just a bunch of if-then sort of instructions. And of course, it's more complicated than that. But the idea is that I think concepts like neural networks, when lawmakers hear them, can be scary. And concepts like deep learning and the deep web, and I don't want artificial intelligence to be seen that way, because although it is empowering and promising, it's not so scary that lawmakers shouldn't be scared to at least try to understand it at a rudimentary level. And so we're seeing, I think, I'm actually very optimistic though. We're seeing a number of white papers come out by governments all around the world that's showing a little bit more advanced understanding about what AI is. And so this is from a high-level EU expert report that just came out that's talked about AI, largely being composed of machine learning and reasoning technologies with sort of robotics on the in both of them. I typically use machine learning to talk about the kind of artificial intelligence that we're talking about needs regulation right now, or needs governing structures. One of my computer science colleagues said, when you're talking to the public, you use the words artificial intelligence. When you're asking for funds, you use the words machine learning. And when you're talking to each other, you use the terms algorithms and data, right? And it's all sort of more or less the same thing. And so that's a really good starting point. Now, the next thing that I think is important to impress upon lawmakers when we're talking about AI governance is the question of why should we care, right? So AI is potentially transformative, it has lots of benefits, but it also needs some kind of regulatory structure. And the reason why it needs regulatory structure, one of the answers that was put forth by a group of researchers at the Oxford Internet Institute, notably Brett Middlestad and some others, they put forth this list that I think is really interesting, where they say we should care about AI because AI systems are being implemented, and if we have inconclusive evidence, right? If our AI leads to inconclusive evidence, it actually could lead to unjustified actions, because often we don't set the thresholds high enough for acting upon some kind of particular decision. And a lot of what I want to talk about today, I should say, it's about automated decision making. So the world of AI is large and vast, and it encompasses a lot of things. My friend and colleague Ryan Kalo wrote a paper that says that AI law and policy has at least 5 different components. The first part is justice and equality, and we have to think about considerations around that. The second part is what are the regulatory structures for artificial intelligence and the use of force, specifically with automated weapons, but also other kinds of uses of force. 3 is safety and certification of artificial intelligence. Do we have any kind of relative safety standards and certification standards? 4th is questions of privacy and power. As artificial intelligence gets used more and more, it will rely upon more and more of our personal data to operate. And when that data is collected, it gives a certain amount of power. So there are questions about how that power is to be used and when it should be broken up. And then 5, taxation and displacement of labor. One of the big concerns when I talk with people about artificial intelligence is the de-skilling of the workforce. We can talk about that a little, though that's not going to be the main area of my talk today. The thing that I really care about right now is automated decision making as a form of artificial intelligence in need of a regulatory structure. Because I think as a practical matter, this is where we see artificial intelligence being deployed most commonly. And so if we have inconclusive evidence, it could lead to unjustified actions. So AI reaches a certain kind of determination based on certain kinds of inputs, and it says that this person is a credit risk, and then it turns out that maybe they're not because it's based on faulty data, and then that person is denied credit wrongfully. Inscrutable evidence leads to opacity. One of the interesting things that we've seen with respect to automated decision making is the use of perhaps diagnostic tools, artificial intelligence and diagnostic tools. At what point, one of the questions that might arise, how do we know whether we can trust the opinion that is coming out of these diagnostic tools? A really interesting example is, let's say that artificial intelligence is increasingly going to be used to recommend treatment for a particular diagnosis, right? So you input a certain set of variables, it runs through an algorithm, and it says you should treat this person by prescribing this much medicine, this much rest, and this kind of diet. And let's say that that proves to be relatively reliable. And maybe we don't need to see how that decision is being made or the logic of that decision because if it's intuitive to us. But eventually that system might arrive. A hypothetical is put forward by some friends of mine, Ian Kerr and Jason Miller, in a paper they did about diagnostic tools and inscrutability, which is, let's say one day the artificial intelligence system gets an input for someone that maybe has an infection in their kidney. And it says the answer to this is you should wave a feather in front of their face for 10 minutes and then give them a sip of water, and we think that that will solve it. And of course we would say, well, that's ridiculous. The problem is that if there's opacity, if the evidence of how that decision is made is inscrutable, then there's no way for us to determine how that decision was arrived at, and we can't interrogate the decision. And so even though such a decision might one day be generally reliable, when it veers off from our embedded notions of what we know about treatments, it's important to be able to interrogate the decision. Misguided evidence could lead to bias, right? This is one of the, and even worse, it could lead to enshrining bias. And so one of the things about automated systems that we are now coming to know as a truism is that they are only as good as the data set upon which they learned, right? So as AI systems learn, it requires more and more data, and if that data is biased, then the result is likely going to be biased, and in potentially harmful ways, because that system could be actually systematized across a large range, whereas bias, that sort of bias might not have been systematized before. Unfair outcomes could lead to discrimination, wrongful discrimination, as AI systems start making decisions on people, start ranking them, start scoring them. It could lead to harmful outcomes for particular populations. Transformative effects could lead to challenges for our autonomy. One of the important things that we lack with respect to AI governance is a coherent theory about when it's okay to offload tasks to artificial intelligence and when offloading certain kinds of tasks to artificial intelligence is corrosive to our autonomy, assuming we value that. So some colleagues of mine, Evan Selinger and Brett Fishman, wrote a really interesting book called Re-Engineering Humanity, where they asked this question, when would it be harmful to us as humans to offload tasks onto artificial intelligence? So a good example that we might use would be certain sorts of tasks we are happy to offload onto AI. So instead of looking up directions, we're happy to program a place into our phone, and an algorithm then shows us how to get to a certain place. We might think of an AI system that would be autocompletes for writing things, and everyone that uses a phone has a certain kind of autocomplete. But what if you were writing a thank you note? So I get home from this trip, I decide to write Kilnam a thank you note. Does it matter that I picked out the words myself? Dear Kilnam, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I had a great time. Or what if Google automatically recommended an entire thank you note? And I could just log in, press one button, thank you note, sent. It's difficult for us because we don't have a coherent theory about offloading tasks to AI, about when it becomes problematic to our autonomy and to our humanity. Another different problem that I'll talk more about tomorrow is transformative effects leading to challenges for privacy. As automated systems become smarter, the drive to improve those systems and calibrate them will depend increasingly on us giving over more of our personal information. Because the argument for AI, particularly personalized AI, is that it works better the more information it has about us. That's going to create a loop where it's always going to keep asking us for more and more information. And an important question that governments around the world are going to have to answer is how much is too much information? So in other words, if there were an AI system that could read my mind, it would be pretty accurate. But it might be scary to have technologies that were literally able to read our mind. And so we need to think about what those lines look like. And then traceability leading to moral responsibility. This is going to be, I think, increasingly important, particularly as we incorporate artificial intelligence into techno-physical systems, like automated cars, for example. One of the really interesting questions that a lot of scholars and lawmakers are asking in the United States is if Google's automated car gets into a wreck, or if Tesla on auto drive gets into a wreck, who is at fault? Right? Is it the person who's behind the wheel? Is it the person who designed the GPS system? Is it the person who wrote the algorithm? Is it someone else? And one of the concerns that scholars often have is that automated systems, because they are so complex and because they can lead to generative, unpredictable behavior, it's a very clever way of hiding moral responsibility in a complex system. In other words, lots of different people that design AI systems might be credibly able to deflect moral responsibility for the harm that an AI system causes because it is so complex. And so if we have time at the end of my presentation, I've been working with a team of roboticists on a theory of attributing fault and moral responsibility within autonomous systems as a very basic way to think about AI governance in a lot of these systems. Another key thing that I think is important to recognize when working with lawmakers and those in industry is to have a clear sense of the potential harms that we're looking to avoid. Because AI is so nebulous and massive and large, it's difficult to get a very clear sense of what specifically the kinds of harms are that we're trying to prohibit. In my other world of privacy law, the way in which we talk about this is sometimes there are very specific kinds of privacy harms, and sometimes people describe privacy harms as creepy, right? And if something is something that you don't like or you don't feel comfortable with, you just say it's creepy. And that doesn't help us much as a regulatory matter. It certainly doesn't help lawmakers craft specific rules on how to talk about harms. And so here, and these slides are available online, the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit think tank in the United States, created a really interesting chart as a way of thinking about potential harms from automated decision making. And the way that they broke up their chart was they talked about individual harms and then collective or social harms for automated decision-making systems. And then they even further divided up individual harms into those that were illegal, at least within the United States and possibly other places, and those that were simply unfair, or those that you might want to think about regulating but might not necessarily be clear-cut against the law. And the first category that they talked about was loss of opportunity. So one of the real fears that should drive AI governance and AI law and policy are making sure that these systems provide opportunities and don't take them away unjustly to certain kinds of people. And so the Future Privacy Forum listed 4 different kinds of losses of opportunity. Employment discrimination, which is where we see a lot of AI systems being deployed. One of the, in my opinion, more terrifying kinds of AI that's being deployed right now in the employment sector is a piece of artificial intelligence that analyzes facial expressions when you interview for a job to see if you are the kind of person that would be a good fit for the job. So So, for example, if you were asked a question and you act really surprised, or maybe you furrow your brow because you're thinking, then the machine could read that as being angry or put off by a question and then score you poorly. And so, as if we didn't have enough to worry about when we interviewed for a job, now we have to make sure that our facial expressions are matched to the system to optimize results. Insurance and social benefit discrimination, housing discrimination, as landlords and people that control housing can start to rely upon AI and analytics to make their decisions. We have a lot of important governance issues to talk about. And then education discrimination. EdTech is increasingly relying a great deal upon AI-powered systems, which can be very good in delivering a meaningful education to people, or it could be disastrous because it has a harmful or differential effect on access to education. Or it could score people potentially in harmful or unjust ways. And so that's the loss of opportunity harm. The next kind of harm that they talk about is economic loss, which is a little easier to articulate. And they say things like credit discrimination, which increasingly relies upon AI-powered systems. So, for example, denying credit to all residents in specified neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining, which is illegal, could result in differential access to credit, a collective societal harm, as well as an individual harm. Differential pricing on goods and services. I teach a number of different courses every year, and when I teach my students, I always try to find an example that gets them interested and invested. And one year I was teaching information privacy law, and I was having difficulty finding an example. I talked about surveillance, and they said, who cares about surveillance? And I talked about social media harms and fake news, and they said, who cares about that? And then I brought up the fact that Orbitz, the travel company, designed an algorithm to detect whether people were using Apple computers or Macintosh or Windows computers. And if you were using an Apple computer, then Orbitz determined that it would show you the more expensive hotel rooms first and the cheaper ones later. And if you were using a Windows computer, you were shown the cheaper hotel rooms first and the more expensive ones later. And my students were outraged because most of them use Apple computers. And so that's something that is when you realize that you are not seeing the same internet as other people based upon your circumstances, and you are being given a worse deal because of it, then that could be seen as a form of economic loss. And then another thing that they talk about is the narrowing of choice. When AI systems deliver ads based on your past activity, then it might limit future exposure to things that you might be interested in. And I see this example now. There's a service that's sort of powered by AI known as Pandora, and it's a music streaming service. And if you like a song, you click yes, and if you don't like you give thumbs up, and if you don't like a song, you get thumbs down. And then over time, that service recommends new songs. And now the service is basically exclusively Beatles songs because it's determined that I like Beatles and only the Beatles. And then I realized maybe I want to listen to something more than the Beatles, but my fate had been sealed. The algorithm determined that I was a Beatles person. And so my choice was narrowed. And then the other thing that they talk about is social detriment, right? And this is not so much in the illegal, but in the unfair. Network bubbles is something that we worry a little about, particularly in the era of fake news and misinformation online, which is when AI systems start to match you based on particular network circles, then you start seeing the same things over and over again, and you live in a form of a bubble, what Eli Pariser called the filter bubble, and it becomes difficult to get access to other kinds of information as a result. dignitary harms, emotional stress due to biases or a decision based on incorrect data. Sometimes an AA system might classify you in ways that feel like a dignitary harm to you. It considers you something that you are not in a way that you consider offensive. And then also a confirmation bias. And so the example they give as a societal or collective harm is an all-male image search results when you type in CEO, right? So if you type in CEO, then it's a bunch of men, right? Which is collectively something that only reinforces what we would consider to be harmful stereotypes in various areas. And so that's an interesting way of thinking about the potential harms. And then at the most extreme level, we have loss of liberty. As AI systems start to get incorporated more by governments, by law enforcement systems, it could result in the loss of liberty. And when there's an error, that could be disastrous for individuals, and then also result collectively in disproportionate levels of incarceration and also increased surveillance. And so I think this chart is a useful way of thinking about the harms of AI, particularly when you're making the case for some kind of governance that is needed. One of the difficult things about researching in the area of AI governance right now is that every week a new report comes out. So a new government has issued a new report on artificial intelligence in government, and it's difficult to stay on top of it. But consistently, one of the in my opinion, one of the best reports that comes out every year is by a group called AI Now out of New York University. And every year they issue a report. And I would commend those to you because they spend a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to stay on top of the most recent developments in AI governance issues. And so they talk about the amplification of widespread surveillance as AI gets better at sorting and ranking, the risks of automated decision making, and then one of the most interesting ones they talked about now is experimenting with models of AI in very public ways. So industry now is able to relatively easily deploy AI systems. We call it A/B testing, where we deploy A here and B here, and we test. And for the most part, A/B testing seems to be pretty harmless. But when you are dealing with massive populations, then it could end up being harmful. Many of you may remember the Facebook emotional contagion study, where they intentionally made certain people's news feeds reflect negative or sad information to see whether that made you sad if you saw nothing but bad information. And the question that brings up some important questions about what are the limits on experimenting in a very public way of people that have not given full informed consent to being experimented on. So I would recommend that to you. They also, one of the reasons that I recommend the AI Now annual reports is that at the end of the report every year, they often talk about proposed remedies. They say, okay, so here are some dynamics, here are some problems in the AI governance space. What might be some proposed remedies? And they give a few. Here's an example of just a few that they've recommended recently. They say don't use black box systems, and by that it's basically an argument for transparency, or at least some sort of scrutability. In other words, ability to interrogate an algorithmically driven system. Run pre-release trials. This seems like common sense, but it's not often deployed, which is you should test your AI before you actually release it. One that isn't commonly used is we should have rules about monitoring AI systems after it has been released. So once it has been deployed and implemented, it must continue to be refined and improved. Increase accountability in workplace management for those that are working with AI. Develop standards for data set use. So this is something that, as far as I know, is completely non-existent in the AI governance space. In other words, we are, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, free worldwide to use any data sets we want to train AI systems that will be then used upon the worlds. This is really problematic if you think about the ways in which problematic data sets can lead to many of the harms that the Future Privacy Forum identified earlier. And so one of the areas for cooperation, I think, in the future is trying to get some standards around data set use for international adoption. Go beyond technical strategies. One of the things that I try to teach my computer science students all the time is that technology can't solve everything, and that we need organizational standards. We need different disciplines, which we'll talk about in the next slide. It needs to be more than just computer science and engineers involved in this. No offense to all the computer scientists and engineers in the room. We need standards for auditing AI that has already been deployed. We need more data on how marginalized groups are affected by artificial intelligence systems. Again, we need to include disciplines beyond CS and engineering. A good start would be anthropologists that spend a lot of time trying to determine how humans will use tools, those within the STS society, philosophers. I think that there's a host, information scientists, psychologists, sociologists. All of these people, all of these disciplines have an important thing to say about AI governance and the creation of AI systems. It should not be solely left up to engineers and programmers. And then finally, create strong accountability. Now, I don't know if I realize now, only too late, that the font is probably too small here. So if you want to download the updated slides off the internet, this is great. But the European Union commissioned a high-level expert group on AI policy and investment on recommendations for trustworthy AI. And they came up with, frankly, what I consider to be a really interesting and provocative document that had 33 different recommendations for policy for investing in trustworthy AI. And each of those 33 recommendations had about 5 or 6 subparts. The whole document is about 60 pages. I commend it to you. I pulled some of what they highlighted as some of the most interesting recommendations for AI governance, which are some of them are very specific, and some of them are very general. And I include them today only to talk about, only to identify potential ways in which you might think about creating rules, or at least identifying problem areas for AI legal frameworks. And so one of them, which I thought was really interesting, is ban AI-enabled mass-scale scoring of individuals, which is occurring in lots of different countries across the world. And so that was interesting to me that they would put that out there, but they see it as a danger if wholly embraced, because AI has so many messy and inaccurate parts to its system that it cautions against relying on mass scoring. And one of the reasons why might be the psychological phenomenon that we call automation bias, which is a tendency for people to trust decisions that are made by computers solely because they're made by computers. In other words, they would do a test where they presented someone and they would say, this person is credit worthy. And if a person said it, then in an experiment, people would push back and they'd say, oh, I don't know, I feel like maybe there's some room for debate there. But if they presented that score as being made by a computer, then people have more of a tendency to trust it for whatever reason, maybe because they think the computers are less error prone than they actually are. They talk about refraining from disproportionate and mass surveillance of individuals, the advent of biometric surveillance, most notably facial recognition technology that is fueled by AI, is developing quickly, particularly within the United States. We see a lot of the technology, and so the EU report has cautioned against that. It also cautioned against commercial surveillance of individuals in society. So it's not just government surveillance that the EU wanted to caution against. It wanted to have a clear talk about red lines, Right now, within AI, because we are in early days, we have not yet come out completely and said, under no circumstances will we allow an artificial intelligence system to do X, Y, or Z. And the EU group recommended that that conversation is one that should be had, and it should be had right now before these systems become entrenched and it becomes too late to make that decision. Apply the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI to AI deployed by the public sector. I view this as an area still in flux. Professor Chan recommended he's got a report that I highly recommend to everyone here that lists many of the different guidelines. And I think that by last count, there are at least 12 or 14 different high-level ethics guidelines. The IEEE has one, the ACM has one, the OECD is adopting one. An organization that I used to clerk for, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, is putting one out, and there are lots of different ethical guidelines. And while they're similar in many ways, they also differ in a lot. Provide information on the logic of algorithms and the data use in algorithmic decision making. That's what we just talked about. Map and evaluate all existing EU laws that are particularly relevant to AI systems. This is probably a good idea worldwide. Before we go creating new rules about artificial intelligence, it's worth taking a deep look and seeing whether existing regulatory structures apply to AI or conceivably could apply to AI. One of the things that I try to caution lawmakers against is seeing AI as entirely a new phenomenon. In many ways, it is. In the same way that in many ways the internet presented new regulatory challenges. But a lot of the harms, and the reason why it's important to analyze the harms, are harms that we've been trying to avoid for a long time. And it might be that existing rules and regulations are sufficient, but you need to have an affirmative audit to figure that one out. Adopt a risk-based approach to new AI regulation and a precautionary principle-based approach for specifically risky AI. This one is really interesting, but one that I think is really important. So I teach tort law in the United States, which is the law of civil wrongs, and it is a law that is explicitly risk-based. So in other words, it's tolerant of risk. It recognizes that there are certain kinds of harms that you are likely going to see, and as long as those harms aren't too great, then it's worth implementing the AI system. And the EU high-level group recommended another risk-based approach. This is how we think about things like, which we can talk about tomorrow, de-identification. Many of you may be familiar with data protection regimes in your country that talk about the de-identification of data. And that often adopts a risk-based approach, which is as long as the data set isn't easy to re-identify, then it's probably okay to release into the wilds if it's hard but possible. However, there are certain kinds of highly risky AI, and for those we should adopt a precautionary principle, meaning we shouldn't allow it unless there's a good reason to do so. So we should have a presumptive default to be cautious or hesitate from implementing it unless we feel as though we can do so safely. Refrain from unjustified personal, physical, or mental tracking, identification, or profiling through biometric recognition. This is similar to and perhaps related to the mass scoring of individuals. Refrain from establishing legal personality for AI systems or robots. This is a really interesting one, and one that I probably agree with, which is that many people are saying that robots should have rights and that AI systems should be recognized as people because they demonstrate the characteristics of people. But this is a way, again, to hide moral responsibility for the creation of those systems. And so I think that it's probably wise to avoid granting legal personality to AI systems, no matter how human-like they might be. Monitor and restrict the development of automated lethal weapons is one. Enable cooperation, so that this high-level group envisioned 4 different groups that must work together in order for AI governance regimes to work. And they identified civil society, industry, the public sector, and then academia, research sector. And those four working together are what's required for meaningful AI governance. Apply worker representation, consultation, and co-creation to address de-skilling. I think this is very important, as many people's jobs will either become redundant or eliminated or change in significant ways. It is important to include workers in the conversation of AI governance to address de-skilling and reskilling or upskilling different kinds of employees. Strengthen children in key human skills, problem solving, critical thinking, judgment, creativity, and empathizing. The idea is that there are certain kinds of skills that are, in the words of the president of my university at Northeastern, President Ayoun, robot-proof. There are certain things that AI systems simply, at least probably in our lifetimes, will never achieve, and that's critical thinking, systems thinking, entrepreneurship, cultural agility, the ability to analyze how AI systems will apply across cultures, empathy. These are the kinds of skills that the EU working group said we should be emphasizing to teaching children, and I would also add to adults as well. AI is going to change the way in which we approach our jobs, and those who are working with AI systems, whose jobs stand to interact with AI systems, also need to be educated, possibly at least, in a lot of these robot-proof competencies. And then finally, consider the volume of data or data advantages in the assessment of market power under competition rules. This one is one that's, I think, is increasingly becoming important, and we're seeing it actually become an issue in the US presidential election, which is the fact that information is power. And the more information platforms get, the more powerful they become. And at a certain point, that becomes relevant for anti-competition laws. And so we need to think better about how should competition rules and antitrust rules work in the age of big data. All right, I think I want to make sure, I wanted to leave a few minutes for discussion, but if there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about. Before we move on, this is the link to the report I was talking about with the high-level group. As Conan said, this is just one version of an approach to AI governance. This is not the approach, and I wanted to talk a little bit about my own research as it applies to AI governance and the attribution of faults and moral responsibility in automated systems. And to that end, I want to talk about a theory that I've been working with, with a group of roboticists called an education and theory for responsibility and faults in autonomous systems. So the problem is this. Most people who work in this area want ethical and legal accountability. That's not very controversial. However, there's no consensus yet on how to go about making people legally and ethically accountable for the creation of AI systems. We're still in the very early days of this technology. Many questions remain unanswered and probably will remain unanswered for the time being. So, for example, who should be held accountable for ensuring that automated systems are made and used ethically? What sorts of values should AI foster, and what sorts of conduct should be encouraged or discouraged? This will, of course, vary wildly according to cultural values and governance systems. When do automated systems pose problems that are new or distinct? This is a really important question that I'd like to emphasize again, which is that sometimes AI problems are not new. They're simply new clothes for old problems. Where should the focus of accountability lie? Is the process of creation where it's important, or does it matter what the AI system reflects? So in other words, and I teach all of my law students this, when you're creating a rule, you could create two different kinds of rules, generally speaking. You could create a process rule, which requires you to go through a particular process when engaging in any particular kind of activity. So a really good example would be a general approach to data security. Data security laws around the world say in order to be secure, you have to take the following steps. You have to implement technical safeguards. You have to audit the data that you have. You have to have a breach response plan put into place. You have to follow these particular procedures. As long as you follow those procedures according to the law, then this process-based law, you are legally compliant. Even if you get hacked, even if it results in a breach, as long as you followed the rule, that's what mattered. Or you could create a system of rules that we call output-based rules. And for output-based rules, it doesn't matter what you did. The only thing that matters was the end result of your efforts. So a really good example are automobile safety standards. At least in the United States and in varying other countries, it doesn't matter how you make your automobile safe so long as it meets a particular threshold of safety. So in other words, it would not result in an injury, every particular number of crashes, or it reaches a particular score, safety score. So we don't know the answer to that question for automated systems yet. Do we want to know why? We want to know why automated systems act the way they do. Should we care about transparency? Or should we focus more on testing, experimentation, and validation for specific purposes? So one of the great debates that we have right now is whether we should be focusing on transparency. We talk about this a lot. We should make algorithms transparent. Or do we care less about transparency because even if we got it, we wouldn't understand what it meant at a sufficient level of complexity? And do we care more about requiring that AI be rigorously tested, that it be validated, that the preconditions for experimentation is what matters? And even if it's not transparent, as long as we interrogated the system enough, then that's what counts in terms of algorithmic accountability. And so many others. And so I got to wondering, as I started thinking about AI governance and automated system accountability, accountable for what? What explicitly and specifically is it that we want to hold people accountable for? And so I teamed up with a few roboticists, Cindy Grimm and Bill Smart, who are roboticists at Oregon State University, to talk about ways in which we might think about identifying faults and moral responsibility in autonomous systems. And if we could identify that, then we can hold actors accountable for that. And we can create rules around it. We can create governance structures. And it resulted in a couple of papers. And very briefly, without taking up too much time, essentially we realize that much of the faults that we see in poorly implemented AI systems has to do with the fact that there are multiple parties involved with the system. There are procurers, there are developers, and there are users. And all three of those parties constantly have to talk to each other, and often they miscommunicate. And the reason they miscommunicate is because it is hard to talk about and understand automated systems in a precise way. The reason why is because human language is imprecise. We create words that get close to what we mean, but it doesn't always represent what we mean. So we say, I want a car to drive on all roads, but maybe we didn't mean dirt roads, right? Or we didn't mean something else. And also, complex systems are unpredictable. They react in ways that we might not have anticipated. A few years ago in Seoul, a automated robotic vacuum cleaner sucked up a woman's hair, and they actually had to call the police to come help her get it out because she was sleeping on the ground. And the designers of that system never contemplated that it might run into someone who was sleeping on the ground and catch their hair. And so And so this was a failure at a certain kind of level. It was either a failure to anticipate the problem, a failure to implement the problem, or a failure to warn. And so the theory that we created as a way of finding fault in autonomous systems was that teams developing automated systems should be responsible for testing and keeping each other informed. Procurers should be responsible to developers. Developers should be responsible for displaying the limits of what an automated system can do back to the procurers, and users should be warned. And so in the paper we talk about many different kinds of failures. Syntactic failures, which is the failure to for a machine to measure what it's supposed to measure. Semantic failures, which is the failure of procurers to adequately articulate from the developers what it wanted. Right? When they say, I want an automated system that can tell me who's a good employee for my job. You have to be very specific about that. Testing failures, so you either, someone didn't test, or warning failures. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but I'm happy to educate. But essentially, it all boils down to what we regard as a duty to educate. Developers have a responsibility to educate procurers on the limits of a system. Procurers have a responsibility to educate developers on what exactly they want out of the system. And if they fail to do that, they are responsible for that failure. And both developers and procurers have a responsibility to users to warn them about foreseeable harms in the AI system that they're using. And that could result in required testing, required education. And the idea is we would have more predictable systems, more accurate expectations, and a way to decide who pays whenever there's a harm. All right, so with that, I've got some other things we can talk about, but we'll go to discussion.